Very good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. Christopher Ludwig here, and welcome back to another edition of the live stream hour. Very pleased for the many of you who are joining us again as we continue our new series of broadcasts, bringing you insights from across the automotive supply chain and value chain. This week, we have I think a really interesting show because there's been some ongoing progression in the world of the automotive supply chain since we've come into, well into a month into this crisis, certainly at least in Europe and North America, with most production plants still shut down. However, if we're living in a medically induced coma in the supply chain, I think it's fair to say that our eyelids have at the very least started to flutter open, and there are some movements across the limbs, and we can see some signs of life, particularly with some plants in Europe, which have actually started some production again, others which are on the verge of doing so, and need plans for more to roll out in the coming weeks. A lot of questions still around that. A lot of that will still depend on further restrictions being lifted, but we certainly see some important signs of life. But with that, we think comes quite a significant change, something of a new normal, as we're calling it, and that's exactly what we want to talk about with you all today, especially with my guests and fellow panelists, in terms of what that new normal looks like in production plants and across the supply chain. So welcome again, as I said. This is our third live stream coming at you since we kicked off, and something we're really enjoying, sharing every week with you, having your feedback and insight. So keeping that going this week again. So just a little flash forward on what we're going to be covering today. As I mentioned, today's the title of our broadcast is Restarting Production in the New Normal. We'll start with a little snapshot again of what's going on, particularly focusing on some of the reopenings which have begun and which we're seeing planned for, and what we might expect to follow after that. I'm then going to be very pleased to hand over to my special guest this week, Ralf Bechmann, who's a partner at ROI Management and has had some pretty extensive experience in the automotive production and supply chain, working with companies for the past 25 years, and now in particularly highly focused on restart plans and building resilience in the supply chain. So we'll hear from Ralf on the specific action plan and points that we all need to consider in the build up to that. And then I'm going to bring on to join us in the Q&A my colleague and fellow panelist, Nick Holtz, who's the editor of Automotive Manufacturing Solutions. That's our excellent manufacturing and automotive, and automation focused publication. And Nick has spent more than a few years traipsing around many factories and shop floors, and so has quite a lot of perspective on how OEMs and suppliers will be in the constraints they're facing on the shop floor, and what some of the changes we might be dealing with in the current crisis will mean as production comes back into view. Like I said, we'll be looking to take questions from all of you participating in our audience, so please send them through and get ready to participate. And at the end, as we've done in the past, we're going to take a little bit of a break and give you a few snapshots from what's happening outside of the coronavirus in some of our other brand coverage. Just a quick reminder and a little flash again of what we at Ultimate Media and Automotive Logistics and Automotive Manufacturing Solutions have been working on and sharing with you together. We've kicked off what we're calling our Automotive Festival of Transformation, switching our print publications digital, for example, coming at you with a lot more live stream interaction and connecting through a lot more digital tools. We've got more content coming up in the next couple of weeks alongside of our program today. Next week, going to be focusing specifically on India, looking at the Indian automotive component and supply chain and how some of the crisis is impacting that and what we might see in the global picture. coming out of it. And then at the end of the month, we're going to come back to our overarching supply chain update with a lot more data and insight. But we'll be sharing more detail on that with you soon enough. Again, just a quick reminder for some of you about the session today. Any questions, comments, use the chat box feature, send them through. If there's a technical issue, our team will come back to you as quickly as possible to try to address that. There's also options to dial in by phone if you're having any issues with the audio on the computer as well. Again, we try and keep this as interactive as possible, so keep the questions coming and flowing. Just type them in throughout. We'll answer them when we come to the Q&A insofar as possible, but put them through as quickly as you can think of them. If you want to talk to us directly during the Q&A session, you can do that. If you raise your hand, there's a raise your hand function there, which you can see with the green arrow. So raise your hand, and then we can turn your microphone on if you so wish. So that's something to keep in mind if you want to. And just a couple of reminders: we are recording this session, so there'll be an archived version of it ready, available on demand for anyone who wants to watch it back. We'll also make the slides available to any of you who are on the program now, and you will get an email link to that latest tomorrow, and they'll be on the website as well. If we don't get to all the questions that you ask, as often happened, we will be recording a follow-up Q&A and putting some content together to make sure that we cover off as many of your questions as we can. So just a quick lay of the land from my side before I hand over to Ralf. When we talked about much of the global supply chain and manufacturing footprint being at something of a standstill, clearly the major exception right now, as all of you know, is in China, with all plants pretty much back up and running and slowly ramping back up. But there are some supply issues, as we'll briefly touch on. So we know that April sales, or excuse me, March sales did pick up significantly from the lows of February, and from our feedback from the market, we understand production and some dealership footfalls moving back up to something like normal levels, although most plants and context from our side wouldn't quite put it fully up to speed yet, maybe about 75%, but nonetheless clearly ramping up. The government is extending support. We've seen EV incentives extended. They lifted limits to car purchasing licenses in cities to try and motivate and push sales. And we've also seen some interesting moves to directly support production and even logistics, whether that's been some liquidity support for suppliers, helping to coordinate transport flows. There were some interesting projects with the Yangtze River and the railways in Wuhan as the lockdown entered. So clearly the government prioritizing automotive in a pretty big way as it gets the economy back up and running in China. But China is part of a global supply chain and produces, as we know, many global brands as well, not least European OEMs and brands. And from our understanding from suppliers and OEMs with their plants there, clearly the disruption risks have obviously moved, clearly focused on Europe and in many cases sometimes North America as well, and indeed other regions as they potentially shut down. And that could put some of those plants under strain, facing shortages and delays out of those regions, not least of all the impact on the Chinese economy that a lack of exports will have, and we've seen some of the pretty drastic falls in output and GDP across other regions. So that's something that will hit the Chinese supply chain. We've also seen perhaps what could be the signs of some consolidation, if you like. The news this week that Renault has withdrawn from its joint venture in China with Dongfeng, at least for passenger cars, and as some brands sort of struggle with liquidity and financially globally, they may well be realigning their networks. There are certainly some questions about what will happen with brands like PSA, for example, who have also struggled there. But that would just be speculation right now. But clearly, there's perhaps some reckoning to come. Turning briefly to Europe, where this is sort of the latest changes, if you like, where we'd say there's the first flashes of life in the supply chain. Some component and powertrain plants already were on, particularly for brands that supplied other regions or the aftermarket. We're seeing a bit more activity for that with Volkswagen, BMW, Daimler turning back on a few plants or getting ready to. But there's also been some movement on the assembly side. Hyundai and Kia both are producing again. Kia first in Slovakia, Hyundai as of this week in Czech Republic, Magna as of yesterday producing the G-Class in Austria, and we understand as well for Renault has reopened some production in Portugal. In the next 2 weeks, there are what looks to be some reasonably solid plans for other brands to move, get assembly lines moving again, particularly Daimler, which is starting some powertrain in plants this week, and then there's plans for Singlefing in Bremen and some others. I believe is next week and the week after, similar for Volkswagen, a group and Audi across a number of locations in Europe, Dacia brand in Romania, Toyota in France and Poland, and Volvo in Sweden, and then other brands have set late April to early May dates, including FCA after Italy extended its lockdown period, and PSA after France did the same, which does also suggest that we have to take some of these start dates with a pinch of salt, because they will be liable to further restrictions and limitations, both in the supply chain and in the market. So it's not all guns blazing yet, but nonetheless, we have significantly more signs of activity this and next week as we did over the last couple of weeks. And that kind of brings us to what I think will be the crux of our session today and our discussion, which is largely that this is maybe a new normal, but it's anything but the normal that we've known. So we're going to talk about it a lot more, but these production and supply chain operations come with new social distancing, safety, and PPE requirements. The supply chain is extremely fragile, with many parts of the network still shut off and shut down. No doubt that there's some logistics and freight constraints out there, and the impacts that may well have on production over time could be significant. And perhaps, most critical is to point out that although plants are starting to be able to resume some production, we don't yet, at least in Europe, have a significant opening of sales channels. So most dealerships remain closed. That means most sales routes are not open, aside from a few ones at relatively small volume. Until those can open as further measures of the lockdown are eased, somewhat hard to see plants ramping up to a large level, especially with other export markets closed. But there's expectations that some of these restrictions could start to lift in a slow way, in a small way, and naturally then that would support some further output. There's a lot of potential changes also in the way plants and supply chains will be run during this period, this new normal, so to say, and whether indeed this new normal becomes something of a permanent normal. Major question from my side and my observations, and something I'm keen to talk about with Ralf and hear from Ralf about, is what focus on resilience we might sort of see in the supply chain, perhaps over some previous considerations on lean or just in time, in order to manage through some of the disruption that we're seeing right now, as well as to respond to demand as it comes in. So there's a lot of complications around it. And one of the things I thought we would do quickly, as we've done in some weeks past, before I hand over to Ralf to talk more about it, is let's do a live poll and get some of the audience's view on this. So first of all, let's talk right about that point on resilience and sort of, let's say, inventory levels and lean versus so inventory versus lean. So I have a question that we're launching now, which should be coming across. So true or false? When production resumes, manufacturers will carry more inventory than now, or they have previously, let's say, to improve supply chain resilience. So simple question, do you think that's true, or do you think that's false? we'll just let our audience vote. You can see the percentage of you voting is shooting up quite quickly. We'll just do that over another 10 seconds. So kind of a sense of whether some of the economics, if you like, of the supply chain will change. So almost all of you have voted in some way now. So I'm going to close our poll and share the results, which I think are fairly interesting, actually. So it's not an overwhelming one, but 58% do think that supply chain is likely to carry more inventory than it has been to improve supply chain resilience. But again, it's not a runaway, massive one there. So I think there's still plenty of room for the debate, which we're going to definitely have during this session. So that's going to bring me to our first speaker and presenter. So, Ralf Bechmann, very, very pleased to bring him on here. Ralf's got 25 years of experience advising and working with manufacturing and supply chain, had previously worked MB Consulting as part of Daimler, later at EY. Lots of experience across the supply chain, R&D, manufacturing, Industry 4.0. And as I mentioned earlier, I think the focus now on resilience, on recovery in the supply chain and getting people getting plants back up in line is a big focus. So Ralf, I think we have you there now, right? Ralf, can
Yes. Yeah. Hi,
Ralf.
Christopher. Yes.
Very pleased to have you, Ralf. Thank you again for joining us from Stuttgart.
Thank you.
Excellent, and I hope that everyone is well with you and your colleagues over there. I'm going to hand over the reins of the slides deck to you, Ralf. It's coming over your way.
So.
Okay, so
now you should see my screen.
We do indeed. Okay, Ralf, so I'm going to leave you to it to share that insight on supply chain recovery, and we will pick it up afterwards in the Q&A.
Thank you, Christopher. Hi and hello to everyone on the call. Yeah, I hope you're well. And talking about this COVID-19 response program to recover and accelerate ramp up, that's really something very interesting. So thank you for the invitation. I would like to talk a little bit about current activities we see in the automotive industry. Of course, about what we are doing, what others are doing, looking at COVID-19 response programs, and of course, talking a little bit around supply chain resilience. I think, Christopher, you already mentioned this, and I think this is a very important topic at the moment. Talking about the current situation and key questions, and I'm quite sure that you are aware of this. So after some operations shut down, I think we saw that nearly every OEM globally has operations shut down. Now they are talking about operations ramp up, and of course, looking ahead, there's something we call operation stabilization. As you might see, and I think this is according to your experience, China is a little bit ahead of Europe, US, the rest of the world. They are already ramping up the factories. It's near normal. Yeah, near normal means not to usual, but near normal. If you look to the EU and US, there will a lot happen over the next 1 to 3 weeks, ramping up factories, which I saw looking at Daimler, Volkswagen, etc. They are all ramping up factories again, and we will see what's happening there. So the key questions when we talk to our clients is always how to prepare for reopening the factories. Yeah, and this is true for OEM, and by the way, true for OES too. Of course, how to implement the safety procedures in the factories, what to do there, how to make, so say, reopening the factories safe. there's a quite uncertainty in the supply chain. What will happen during the ramp up? What's happening with not only the tier ones, but with the tier Ns, tier twos, tier threes? Are they happy and ready to ramp up again? Or will we see disturbed global supply chains and distressed suppliers that are along the value chain down to the tier Ns? And of course, it's not only about reopening the factories. There's a big question around, okay, what's about the automotive market recovery? And that's really a hot one. We have seen this in China, and we are hoping that this is happening the same in the US and in Europe, but we will see. Yeah, so these are the key questions, and going back to these questions, we see a lot of activities at OEM as well as OES on the plant level, on the supply chain level. Looking at the plant activities, there's everything around short time work. You're aware of this. Then, of course, doing in-house manufacturing risk assessment, stress tests. What will happen if we have massive demand fluctuations? What will happen to assembly line capacities, setting up ramp-up playbooks and safety protocols? That's a must. I think every OEM I've met over the last couple of weeks is working on that. And this is not including the in-house manufacturing network, but this is also including the supplier network, of course. We have some weak launch preparation ongoing, of course. There are some new vehicles to be launched in Q3, Q4, Q1 21, and OEMs and suppliers are still working on it heavily. Yeah, so this is not really paused as to our understanding. There are new products, manufacturing medical products, you're aware of this, as well as giving global purchasing support, for example, talking about masks, etc. Looking at the supply chain activities, yeah, this is everything around the supplier base scan about which are the supplier risks we might face over the next couple of weeks. This is not only about part suppliers, but this is including tool and manufacturing equipment suppliers too, of course, LSPs, etc. Yeah. So overall, it's the total supply base, so say not only direct material, but indirect too. Ongoing inventory assessment. I think that's pretty clear. Everyone's trying to understand what kind of inventory, do we have the right inventories in the supply chain, and how long will this take us? Yeah. And of course, looking at after sales. But these are, so to say, the current activities we see at OEM as well as OES. And now there's a key question, how to prepare for this industry ramp up, who's already going on in China, now starting in Europe, in the US, etc. Based on our experience, we have put together so what we call it COVID-19 response program. You can see the elements from looking at crisis impact to secure survival, to plan recovery, to accelerate ramp up, to realign strategy, and of course to build resilience. And not to get into much of that very deep, you can have a look at this on our website because we have they are very detailed and description of the approach, so you can have a look at this. I want to focus on plan recovery, accelerate ramp up, and of course building resilience, as mentioned before. And just to give you some insight on what do we see at our clients at the moment, what are their current challenges, and what are actions they have taken over the last couple of weeks and they are still working on. Yeah, maybe this is something interesting you can use in your own company. I'm quite sure about this. So of course, getting transparency on critical tier N supply chains, That's a must at the moment, understanding what's happening in the supply chain, doing supply chain risk assessments, identifying critical supply chains, not only in critical supplier regions, for example, looking Europe, there we have Italy and Spain, quite critical. Which are the suppliers you have there doing supply chain risk assessment? Or getting transparency on your supply chain delivery performance. What's about demand, inventories, and your capacities you have with your suppliers along your critical supply chain. I think that's another one very important to do. What we see at the moment, there is some increase in distressed suppliers, but there's still some uncertainty if what's the real impact on that on the supply chain. Looking at a number of distressed suppliers, so that's why we wrote down here it's expected increase in the distressed suppliers. Our clients are running what we call a 360 supplier health check, looking at financial and operations topics at the suppliers, making sure that this is working in the future or during the ramp up at least. Secure own manufacturing capacity, again, talking about risk and risk mitigation. And of course, it's difficult to plan in these uncertain times. That's why we're talking about scenarios. Yeah, what will happen in supply chain? What's the impact on in-house manufacturing, etc. So just to summarize, it's transparency, it's risk identification and mitigation, and this is true not only for your supplier base, but for your own manufacturing footprint. That's what we really see at the moment. Yeah, task force are working around this. Then, of course, as we are now in some kind of a ramp-up phase, there's the question how to get it done. Yeah, and of course, everyone's talking about task forces. It's not a supplier or a manufacturing task force, it's a cross-functional task force. So from every department, people working on the ramp up, bringing in their point of view, but really being 100% focused on that. Top management commitment, that's a big one. So we have high caliber top management sitting in our rounds and talking to them what's happening next and what has to be decided. Supply chain delivery performance, of course, has to be ensured. Actions have to be taken, looking at output, delivery performance, quality, etc. Not a real surprise, but it has to be done now. And I think it has to be done very quick. This is something we put a focus on. Safe ramp up for in-house manufacturing. Yeah, talking about is workforce safety regulations. These have to be implemented before reopening the factories, and of course you have to make sure that everything aligned when you reopen the factory, and of course when you have opened the factory that everything is according to the newly defined standards. And not to forget product launches, SOP. I think I just mentioned it before. Yeah. What we see on the one hand side, yes, you have to do a plan. You need to have a plan. You do a close control, and you need to be pragmatic. But nevertheless, you have to be flexible. Think about scenarios, get into this, and that's what we really see at our clients. So no day is the same as the day before. So you have to be really quick to the point and act, yeah, accordingly. So just to summarize it and put it on some kind of a timeline, that's from the operation shutdown to ramp up to stabilization, and the clients we are working with, they are doing some kind of COVID-19 ramp up program. You see a rough structure in here, from supplier task forces to in-house manufacturing task force, to securing their new product launches. starting with assessment, implementation, monitoring. Yeah, like a PDCA cycle, plan, do, check, act. This has to be implemented, but not over months, but now within weeks. And next to this, we have some clients that are already thinking on the next steps, so say. That's why I've put it in here too. This is what we call the COVID-19 program Next. Yeah, thinking about performance improvement or thinking about an operation strategy update that's needed after COVID-19. So very structured approach, and most of our clients are thinking, so say, not only in buzz or keywords, but they really want to have something they can have a touch it and look and feel. So there you can see, and you can have a closer look afterwards in the slides. They will be distributed on what we are doing there, from assessment to implementation to monitoring. We said it's a 6-week program that we are already working on with our clients. Yeah, some are in week 2, some are in week 3. And what we are doing there, I think we already discussed around it, that's supply chain risk assessment, that's demand capacity inventory management, talking about supply health checks, etc. And not to forget this ramp-up playbook and safety protocols implementation, that's a must. Yeah. That's why I want to take some closer look on this, especially if you talk about the social distancing strategies. You need to define some separation guidelines. You need to talk about PPE and disinfection guidelines. As I'm a lean guy, I think it's especially interesting to talk about the separation guidelines. For example, if you talk about workplace separation in an assembly line, with 1 meter or 1.5 meters distance, you have to make sure that people are working accordingly, for example, by workplace visualization, or by using some production transfer aids, or by doing really shift separation. So week shift 1 is not meeting shift 2 during shift exchange, etc. So this has all been organized, and this is something that has to be well organized. So next to what we are currently doing, our clients are already thinking ahead, and that's why we're talking about is building supply chain resilience. You see some actions on these slides. I just want to talk about is rather supply chain design, about partnership, supplier collaboration. Here we see some increase in partnership-based supplier collaboration again. We are talking around supply chain risk management. I already talked about this, what has to be implemented, and not to forget increase or enhance supply chain agility. I think there's a lot of discussion around should or do we have a dual sourcing strategy. Some of our clients already have it, but they are mostly focused on one supplier, having a second supplier in the back, so to say, or thinking about the inventory strategy. I think that's something we can discuss later on, because yeah, for the moment we have to do so, but everyone's thinking already ahead, and so say being effective and efficient still in the manufacturing process. Inventory strategy probably is something that has to be aligned with your overall production system. Yeah. So you can have a look at this later on. And of course, not to forget, and this might be some guideline for you, we have put together some, I would say, product or tool roadmap, and you might use it too for your company, because what you see on here has been, is so say, some kind of a proven approach. What we're currently doing is working with our clients on the supply chain resilience assessment, understanding the supply chain risk, for example, looking at critical suppliers, etc., and then going to the next steps, for example, reviewing the tier N supply chain network. Once again, this is around supply chain design, supplier collaboration, and what we see on supply chain risk management. It's aligned by short to medium to long term, and of course, you can take the necessary actions accordingly. So before starting our discussion, I wanted to give you some insight on what we see as the future changes in the automotive supply chains. Of course, on the one hand side, currently everyone's talking about supply chain risks and then is reacting accordingly when it comes into reality. What we see in the future, yeah, you have to be aware of supply chain risks and then thinking in scenarios. You have to be prepared for scenario implementation. Yeah, and that does not necessarily means that you are increasing your buffers, but really be prepared for that. Yeah, and being flexible in what you're doing. Everyone's talking about, okay, we will see more local supply chains. What I've seen over the last couple of years, indeed, we have global to local, but we have a lot of local to local supply chains. Localization degree in the automotive industry is quite high. Yeah, in some countries, 80 to 90%. So we will see an increasing number of local to local supply chains, but I'm not quite sure if there will be a massive change looking at the automotive industry. We will see a move from tier 1 to tier N management, understanding the supply chain. And of course, we will see some integrated demand capacity and inventory management. Yeah. And finally, yeah, tier 1 localization, I already mentioned it, to tier N in-depth localization. Yeah, not only the tier 1s localized, but the tier Ns are localized too. I think that's something the automotive industry is already working on for the last couple of years, but this will be now speed up. So yeah, thank you. That's for the moment. May I give you back to you, Christopher?
Absolutely, Ralf. Thank you so much. Thanks again. I think that was some fantastic insight there and some real clear, if you like, actions and considerations that OEMs and tier suppliers can certainly use. You know, specifically, kind of, I'm sure many are beginning this process, and many others will be considering it. And obviously, again, a lot of considerations here as we really look at what I described earlier as a new normal. I'm keen to open this up to Q&A. We've already had some great questions. First, I'd like to virtually welcome into our discussion as well Nick Holtz, the editor of AMS, Automotive Manufacturing Solutions. So, Nick, can I beam you in? There he is. Nick, can you hear me?
I can, Chris. Yes.
All right, fantastic, Nick. Nick, great to see you, albeit across opposite sides of London right now, and great to have your perspective here. Nick, one of the things I wanted to start talking about together with Ralf. Obviously, Ralf talked about some of those social distancing, safety requirements, etc. that are all OEMs are going to have to bring in, and we've already seen it in China, and we're certainly going to see it and are seeing it in the plants that come online in Europe. It kind of suggests to me some immediate changes to tack time, some disruptions, if you like, to the usual layouts and flows that we would expect in really high capacity utilization of manufacturing plants. Do you see that as a sort of fundamental challenge, risk for manufacturers to implement this? Are there going to be some changes to the economics, if you like, of manufacturing, at least in the short term? I just want to start with your view, and then we'll open that up.
I think on a very shop floor practical level, car makers are better prepared than it might initially seen, because they have a lot of processes already in place to deal with ramping up and ramping down of plants. I mean, summer breaks for plants are quite common. They will bring the production down to nearly zero in some instances if they're retooling or refurbishing a plant. So this is a deeper problem, obviously, with COVID-19, the impact of it, but the basic fundamentals of how they do that are there. Similarly with, I think Ralf mentioned their assembly line. If you look at, that's probably the most populated area of a car plant. But the line side stations are very modular. So on a practical level, they can move them apart. They can put some degree of separation in there. And the low level of demand that we're certainly going to see at the moment means that the capacity utilization should be completely at rock bottom. So the takt times can be increased. You can gap the vehicles going down the line by 1 or 2 cases. I know they sometimes do that when they're bringing in new platforms and things like that to give the line side guys time to get it to adjust. The teams that work on the vehicles are trained to do more than one operation. So where you might see 3 individuals working to put one part of the vehicle together at, say, the front end, that could be hived off or split up. And also in terms of sort of health and safety, I mean, PPE is quite common, gloves you often see, and the implementation of adding other things in, you can see them having those capabilities to be able to bring that, to make that, and we're talking about the new normal, to make that the new normal for their operations. I think the new normal will take on new normal will change over each phase, as Ralf was talking about, different phases as they go through. But bringing in and making that part of their process is what they're very good at in terms of training the workforce. And they use a lot of visual signage. They use their communication structure from sort of senior production operational management down to the lines is very organised. Admittedly, there will be some need for social distancing. They can't have the group sessions that they often do at the line side, but it is possible for them to adapt that. So I see it as adapting and enhancing what they already have. Admittedly, it's not as easy as that by any stretch of the imagination. And Ralph's pointed out some of the, beyond just getting the lines running again, some of the bigger challenges. But it's almost, I kind of see it as a sort of the term that's used as a Kaizen. So the constant sort of looking for improvement. That's an ongoing thing with manufacturing anyway, to improve efficiencies. This is another sort of facet of that, if you like. So I believe that the car manufacturers will be, and to some extent the tier suppliers, will be able to deal with some of these things, and not easily, but they will be able to do that. The impact, as Ralf has really clearly laid out here, and I think really highlighted, is you can't build cars without parts. So and the tier 1 and tier 2 guys are reasonably visible within that supply chain, and depending on where you are in the world, beyond that, it seems less transparent and it's less easy to control. And as Ralf mentioned, it has got better, and there's a lot more coordination now. But that does pose challenges regionally, depending on where you are, as to how fast you can get that plant going. There is a slight thing I noticed in parts of the world I've been to where supply chains have been less reliable or less resilient. Then there is a higher level of inventory within the plant, so that may act as a slight buffer to issues that they may have getting started. But I think it's going to be, there are lots of small details that they'll have to work out, but I think they have the processes to get that started and to get going on that. But I think supply chain could be the biggest problem.
Does that kind of align with your views there, Ralf, as well? I mean, certainly in this time of low volume, the capacity utilization may be less of a problem. I suppose one of the things from my side is to think that this new normal, as we're calling it, might well be with us even as volumes have an opportunity to ramp up, because the phasing down, if you like, of some restrictions. We may still be living with some of these restrictions 6 months from now. 8 months from now, we may have a new phase back into them. So this is a new volatility that is perhaps, will be with us for a long time. So how well equipped do you see, these OEMs and supply chains as being able to cope with that?
I think once again, from my perspective, the OEMs are quite well prepared. They are already working on this. Yeah, they are well prepared. They have already set up their task forces, looking at supply chain, looking at their own manufacturing footprint, etc. But looking at suppliers, yeah, so say looking downstream, it might be different. Yeah, and of course, what we will see is that there might be the one or the other distressed supplier looking at the tier N level, and this might be getting some real problem. Yeah, not only for the tier 1, but for the OEM too. Yeah.
Right.
So yes.
Yeah. So that point, as Nick was also alluding to as well, I mean, there's some lack of transparency, and we've seen that historically throughout the automotive industry at various points, be it single suppliers bringing down regions, or sort of single suppliers in a region bringing down plants on other sides of the world, and things like that. Ralf, you highlighted the tooling and equipment suppliers, which could potentially be a risk as well. So not necessarily just that front line, but multiple levels back. What can, as OEMs shape these task force, as they monitor a critical supply, as they try to stress test across the supply chain and in factories, what can they practically do when they find these potential breakpoints? In theory, okay, you can have an alternative supplier, but if there isn't one readily available, or if we have a situation where potentially 10 suppliers are in distress, which we may well face when we get going, what are some practical things that can be done, now or then to actually manage
that? I think that's indeed what we do when we talk about a supply task force. Yeah, doing some supplier stabilization work, but not only one OEM, but OEMs working together, because one tier N supplier is mostly delivering to some OEMs, so they are working together on stabilizing the supplier. Yeah, that's of course number one, and then you have first you have to find out what's the real problem. Is it a pre-supplier problem? Is it a output problem? It's a quality problem, whatever it might be. And then you need to step into this. This is operations. Yeah, mostly this can be solved. But if you talk about financials, that's of course something different. Talking about liquidity and insolvency management, then it's a different approach, of course, because then we're talking about, for example, financial help on behalf of the OEM. Then we are talking about looking for a second source. Yeah, of course, this is quite normal then. But if there is no second source, you need to talk about financial support. Yeah, next to operational support. And this is mostly something, some suppliers are very common with this. They have departments focusing on critical parts management, insolvency management, and then they are moving on like in, so to say, normal times. Key question, is there a lot higher number of suppliers that might get distressed? Yeah, and what will happen then? Yeah, that's why we're doing this at the moment with some of our clients proactively, trying to identify who might be a distressed supplier in the future. Yeah, so we can act proactively and not just when we are already talking about supply chain shortages or supply shortages or insolvency or etc. Yeah,
absolutely. So we've had a flood of questions in. I can already tell you that we'll we'll have to schedule some additional time, later to cover all of them, but we'll cover off some of them as we can. So trying to group a few together in a topic that maybe I can start with you on, Nick, because there's a few questions around the role that automation and technology, digital technology and tools might play, both in sort of managing the social distancing parts of the requirements, and as well as, kind of in improving the resilience kind of going forward. There was even a question if can virtually all people maybe even be replaced to kind of deal with this and stuff. So that's maybe at the extreme end of it. But maybe even starting with sort of today and the restart, what can happen over the next couple of weeks as some of these plants get up, and the role that some automation and technology might play. Maybe start with Nick, and then Ralf, be keen to hear from you as well.
I think, I've seen a few automation players talking about increasing levels of it, and we even before coronavirus, we were starting to see, you mentioned the assembly line earlier, I think it was Nissan, started to introduce some automated processes that for years had been manual processes and didn't seem like they could be easily transferred into a robot doing. Automation's never, in my conversations with plant managers and line managers, it's never been the silver bullet to make the line necessarily better. I mean, it increases quality and consistency, but it can be very inflexible at times, and it's expensive as well. I think where I see automation or digital systems, and I know I wanted Ralph's opinion on this actually. Sort of Industry 4.0 has been around with this for a long time, and it's been gathering momentum. We see now it's part and parcel. It's one of those things that continues to develop, and that the potential of it continues to be realised in various plants at various degrees. But we are seeing a lot of remote monitoring of equipment and people. And all of that kind of plays now much more to the need for social distancing, for being able to be on top of things, and the greater transparency across the workforces at the moment. So, I mean, I see the digital side because it's already there, and it's just a case of how much further you use it and take it within your business. I think that in the shorter term certainly will be a more effective tool for manufacturers, tier suppliers, car manufacturers, than necessarily just resorting to automation as a result. So I don't think in the short term, and also there's a financial issue here. Car makers and tier suppliers are not going to be looking to be making huge capital investments at this moment. They're going to be looking to consolidate what they're doing, how they do it, try and do it better as they always do. So in a longer view, they might look at automation as a better solution, but in the short term, I don't think it will be. I think digital tools will be the weapon of choice for this particular phase we're in at the moment, for the next 12 months, 2 years, maybe even.
Thanks, Nick. Ralf, again, do you see any particular tools or technology that might play a bit more of a role here? I mean, that doesn't necessarily have to also be automation. There could be AI, perhaps, in some data analysis, for example, when we talk about really trying to stress test a tier 2 or 3 supply chain of uncountable kind of numbers. Perhaps there's other roles. Do you see any kind of technology that amongst your clients which are maybe they're starting to turn to or accelerate, which they hadn't before?
I think digital factory implementation has already started before COVID-19. Yeah, so this is nothing really new. Everyone's aware of it. Nevertheless, I think this will speed up now. Yeah, so there was a lot of discussion. What's the understanding of digital factory, etc. But this will speed up now. And as you said, we are talking about, for example, digital twins. Yeah, really getting real-time overview, transparency, what's happening in a factory and what's happening along the supply chain. Yeah, and this might get even more important if you want to get or if you want to install some supply chain risk management. You need to understand what's happening in your supply chain. So you need transparency. Transparency means just use digital methods, yeah, like a digital twin approach. Of course, looking at the plant, There we see everything around total productive maintenance supported by digital, etc. Yeah, or quality analytics used in outbound logistics. Yeah, I think they are. Every OEM, I would say nearly every OEM is already working on this, but now this will speed up. Yeah, despite of the discussion around investment, etc. But I'm quite sure this will speed up now. What we see, digital or projects around digital are very important to our clients at the moment. Yeah, next to setting up task forces, etc.
Absolutely. Okay, thanks both. So again, another set of questions I would say, if I try to group some themes together, there was questions around, in particular, how do you actually restart production without having much of a sales forecast possible? So if you're kind of thinking along the lines of S&OP, and again, the dealerships order books kind of mostly still being closed. You know, I think if we look at Germany, I don't even if you bought a car, you couldn't register it officially or something. So how do you actually restart plans, plan production with such uncertainty, with in some cases virtually no demand, and does that sort of raise a question? This is some of the questions coming from our audience. Does that actually make us question whether some of these restart dates in the very near future are actually likely to happen or to continue? So maybe starting with Ralf there, do you think that fundamentally threatens some of these restarts even in the short term, or OEMs, they have other kind of means that they're kind of doing right now to build even with demand roughly shut off in so many markets?
As from my point of view, we will probably see some short time work over the next couple of weeks. Yeah, so this won't be finished just with the ramp up. This is number one. Number two, of course, we will see some low volume assembly. Yeah, so it won't go up within the next two weeks up to the normal. Yeah, to the peak volume we had before. Yeah, so some low volume assembly, and this makes it probably easier to install these playbook and safety regulations. Yeah. Of course, and that's what we see at our clients. They are doing what they call stress tests. Yeah, so they want to understand how to organize an assembly line, for example, with significant demand fluctuations. Yeah, you can't bundle orders along the assembly line, but really prepare for a very high variety mix. Yeah, and this is another one. So this is for me topic number 3, really talking on how to do stress testing and how to react on low volume assembly. And yeah, I think these are for me the key topics.
Okay, yeah, great. Again, I'm aware of the time, and we still have some questions we haven't got to. I'll try and take, just kind of move fairly briefly through one or two more, and then, like I said, we'll put together some other content. We had some questions again, which I might group around collaboration, if you like. I mean, there's a couple of ones. So one is an interesting question. In recent times, there's been a trend towards integrated solutions in manufacturing. So suppliers sort of working together to build modules and modular solutions. Does the crisis kind of bring that, suggest that cooperation might increase, perhaps especially in maybe managing through some of these uncertainties? And I suppose in a broader collaboration question, which is also coming through, is whether we really are seeing it or will see it, because it's been talked about for a long time. If OEMs and tier suppliers, or even OEMs and OEMs, will really work together during this period in ways that we've long heard that they will and should. So maybe we'll try and keep this brief just for the interest of time right now. But maybe start with Nick on that point.
Yeah, I think that's already been happening. If you before the COVID outbreak, we were talking to a lot of tier suppliers, and the push for EV had meant that their role with the OEMs, with the car makers, had increased from just being a supplier of parts to a supplier and partnerships within systems, developing systems. So I think the foundation for that kind of collaboration was already there. And I think the digital tools, as Ralf was mentioning there, digital twins, the ability to pass information about a given part in various iterations of the production process to others. It's perhaps an ideal world, but perhaps one where everyone talks to each other, collaborates and cooperates. But I think it definitely will be probably accelerated now. So I think the foundation has already been there with a lot of the leading tier ones. Certainly, it's much more of a partnership than a simple supplier relationship than it used to be. So.
On your side, Ralf, do you see that kind of supplier modular collaboration increasing, and also again the kind of wider need for collaboration across the sector?
Yeah, for me, collaboration is key. Yeah, collaboration between suppliers or supplier OEM. I'm quite sure that this need to be increased if it's not already happening. And I'm quite sure if you want to have a win-win situation out of this COVID-19, you have to increase collaboration. Yeah.
Okay. Well, listen, guys. Again, we've sort of come up to around the hour now, and so before I close, I want to thank both of you, and I'm going to hold you onto the spot right now to agree that we set up some time in the coming days to kind of talk through some of the other questions that have come through. There's quite a range of them, and there's a whole bunch of, for example, logistics-oriented questions, Ralf, perhaps in particular we can go through, for example, around how kind of managing backlogs of product inventory at ports and a number of other areas. So we don't have time to necessarily go through them in the detail that they deserve right now. So at that point, I'm going to suggest that we regroup and again. So I'm going to, for the time being, thank both of you. Nick, thanks again for joining us. Ralf, thanks again so much for your presentation, and we'll be seeing each other soon. So thanks to both of you. We're looking to continuing to be with you, share this time with you, and support you during this crisis as we move further into lockdown. But as things, as we've seen today, do continue to evolve. We're not quite in the shutdown phase that we were even a few weeks ago. So keep with us. Send us your comments and questions. We'll come back to you with more content in the meantime. Thanks so much again. This is Christopher Ludwig signing off from London. Sunny day. Hope it is where you are too. Thanks a lot.